You know Reed Drummond from her hit Pioneer Woman TV show. And tonight, Channel 8 takes an exclusive look at life on her famous ranch.
Everyone thought the Drummonds had the perfect life. Beautiful ranch, happy family, a love story millions admired. Then something happened behind closed doors that nobody saw coming. At 57, Ladd made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. What did Reed's diagnosis really mean for their future? And what is Ladd truly saying goodbye to? Join us as we find out. The perfect life. Yeah, that wasn't. Everyone knew Reed Drummond. She was the woman with the big smile, the warm kitchen, and the boots caked in red Oklahoma dirt. She cooked massive meals for her husband and 4 kids. She photographed sunsets over rolling plains. She turned her life on a remote cattle ranch into something millions of people wanted to watch, read about, and dreamt of living themselves. She called herself the Pioneer Woman, and America believed every word of it. Her husband Ladd was always beside her in that story. Quiet, broad-shouldered, and steady as the land he worked. He did not need the cameras or the attention. He just showed up, fixed things, fed cattle, and loved his family. People admired him for exactly that kind of quiet strength. Together, they built something rare, a brand that did not feel like a brand at all. It felt like a real family, on a real ranch, living a real life. There were no polished press releases or carefully managed moments. At least, that was how it looked from the outside. Reed's blog had millions of readers. Her cookbooks sold in enormous numbers. Her Food Network show ran for years without slowing down. Her store in the small town of Pawhuska drew visitors from across the country. Everything pointed to a family thriving at the peak of everything they had worked for. But people who paid close attention started noticing small things, gaps between posts that used to come daily, a certain tiredness behind the cheerful words, appearances that got quietly canceled, a husband who seemed to be stepping back from the work that had always defined him. Something had shifted on that ranch. Nobody was saying what it was, but something had definitely changed. When the ranch fell silent, the Drummond Land and Cattle Company is not a small operation. It stretches across hundreds of thousands of acres in Osage County, Oklahoma. It is one of the largest ranch operations in the entire United States. The land has been in the Drummond family for generations, passed down like something sacred, something that carries the weight of identity along with the weight of responsibility. Ladd Drummond grew up knowing that land. He did not just inherit it, he worked it every single day. He was the kind of rancher who was out before sunrise, checking on cattle, managing pastures, making decisions that kept the entire operation moving. His hands-on leadership style was not just a personality trait, it was the foundation that everything else was built on. Ranch life runs on consistency. The cattle need feeding on a schedule. The land needs managing through every season. The business side requires sharp attention and constant decision-making. For years, Ladd handled all of it with the kind of quiet discipline that ranching demands. People who worked alongside him understood that he was not just the owner, he was the operator. Then, sometime around 2023, things began to look different. Those close to the operation started noticing that Ladd was delegating more than usual. Cattle sales that he would have personally overseen were being handed off to others. His brothers, Tim and Doug Drummond, were taking on responsibilities that had previously belonged to Ladd alone. His workdays were getting shorter. His presence on the more physically demanding parts of the ranch was becoming less frequent. At first, people assumed it was a natural evolution. Operations grow, leaders delegate. That is simply how businesses develop over time. But the shift felt different to those who knew Ladd well. It felt less like strategic delegation and more like necessary adjustment. Less like a choice, and more like a response to something happening beneath the surface. Ranch communities are tight. People talk quietly, but they pay close attention. The cowboys, the staff, the neighbors who had watched the Drummonds for decades all felt something unspoken settling over the land. Nobody pointed fingers. Nobody made accusations. But the questions were there, hanging in the dry Oklahoma air like dust after a truck passes on a dirt road. Where was Ladd? Why were his brothers carrying so much more of the load? What had changed inside the operation that nobody was openly talking about? The ranch was still running, the cattle were still being fed, but the man who had always been at the center of all of it was slowly, quietly stepping back. and the people around him were left to wonder why. The woman who stopped sharing, Ladd Drummond's blog, The Pioneer Woman, launched in 2006 and quickly became one of the most widely read personal blogs in the world. She wrote about cooking and ranch life and raising 4 children in a place far from any city. She posted photographs that were warm and golden and full of life. People did not just follow her, they felt like they knew her. Her Food Network show extended that intimacy even further. Cameras moved through her kitchen, her yard, her community. Viewers watched her cook for cowboys and celebrate birthdays and host holidays with a kind of effortless generosity that made her feel like everyone's favorite neighbor. She was not performing distance. She was performing closeness, and she was very good at it. Then, slowly and without announcement, the sharing started to thin out. Blog posts that used to appear multiple times a week began appearing less often. The tone of what she did share started to feel more carefully chosen. Photographs were still beautiful, but they felt more considered, more curated. The raw, spontaneous energy that had made her early content feel so alive was being replaced by something more controlled and measured. Her social media presence followed the same pattern. Posts went up, but the comments she made felt lighter, less personal. She was still present, but she was no longer fully open. There was a new layer between Ree and her audience, thin enough that most people did not notice it immediately, but thick enough to feel once you started looking. Public appearances were scaled back. Events that she might have previously attended with enthusiasm were quietly passed on. Interviews became less frequent. The relentless output that had sustained her brand for nearly 2 decades began operating at a noticeably slower pace. People who had followed her for years picked up on the change. Comment sections filled with gentle concern. Fans asked if she was okay. Some assumed burnout. Others assumed trouble. Most simply missed the version of Ree who had once shared everything without hesitation. What they did not know was that the silence was not a retreat. It was protection. Something real and serious was happening inside that family, and Ree had made the quiet decision to guard it, at least for a little while longer. Everything nearly ended. To understand where the Drummond family is now, it helps to go back to a single afternoon in March 2021. That was the day that changed everything, even if the world did not fully understand it at the time. A wildfire had broken out on the Drummond ranch. This was not unusual in itself. Wildfires are a part of life on the Oklahoma plains, especially in dry and windy conditions. Ranchers know how to respond. They move fast, they work together, and they do what needs to be done to protect the land and the animals. Ladd responded the way he always responded to problems on the ranch, without hesitation and without waiting for someone else to take the lead. He got in a fire truck along with his nephew Caleb and headed out to fight the fire the same way ranchers have always fought fires on open land. What happened next was the kind of accident that changes a family permanently. The fire truck Ladd and Caleb were traveling in collided with another fire truck. The crash was serious. Caleb was injured. Ladd suffered far worse. He broke his neck in the collision, an injury that, under slightly different circumstances, could have ended his life or left him paralyzed. The fact that he survived without permanent paralysis was, by any honest measure, something close to miraculous. Ree was not with him in that moment. She found out the way spouses find out in emergencies: a phone call. A rush of information that the brain struggles to process quickly enough. The man she had built everything with, the quiet, steady force at the center of her life and her family and her ranch, had nearly been taken from her on an ordinary afternoon in the middle of a field fire. She wrote about it on her blog and spoke about it publicly. She described the fear and the relief and the long recovery that followed. She was open about how frightening it had been, but even in her openness, there were things she held close. The private weight of realizing how suddenly everything can disappear. The invisible shift that happens inside a person when mortality stops being abstract and becomes something that nearly arrived at the door. Ladd recovered physically, he healed, he went back to the ranch. Life continued in the way that life does after near disasters, with gratitude mixed with a new kind of awareness that sits permanently just beneath the surface of ordinary days. But that crash left marks that X-rays cannot show. It changed how both of them thought about time and presence and what actually matters when everything else falls away. And it planted a seed of understanding that would grow much more significant when the next crisis arrived. The diagnosis that changed the future. For a long time, The signs were easy to explain away. Fatigue made sense for someone running a media empire from a working cattle ranch. Stress was expected when you were managing cookbooks, a television show, a retail store, and a family all at the same time. The occasional bad day, the low energy, these things did not immediately raise alarm bells for someone living the kind of life Ree and Ladd Drummond were living. But bodies have a way of making themselves heard when they are being ignored. In early 2024, what began as a routine medical checkup turned into something far more serious. The kind of appointment that starts ordinary and ends with a doctor sitting down and choosing words carefully. The kind of conversation that divides a person's life into before and after. Ladd had been experiencing symptoms that had been quietly accumulating for longer than anyone had realized. Things that had been dismissed as the natural wear of ranch life in middle age were suddenly being looked at differently. Tests were ordered, results came back. And what those results revealed was a serious long-term condition that required immediate attention and significant lifestyle changes. The exact nature of the diagnosis has remained private. The Drummonds have not made a formal public announcement about what specifically was found, but the pattern of changes that followed tells its own story clearly enough. Specialists became part of their regular life. Managing the condition required ongoing medical oversight, not just a single treatment and a return to normal. Medication needed monitoring. Travel to medical appointments was added to a schedule that was already demanding. The unpredictability that comes with managing a chronic condition, the good weeks and the harder ones, the adjustments that have to be made when the body does not cooperate with plans, all of it became part of their new daily reality. For Ree, the emotional weight of this was significant. She had already lived through the terror of the 2021 crash. She had already felt what it meant to nearly lose Ladd. Now she was facing something different, but equally serious. Not a sudden crisis, but a long road that required patience, consistency, and a complete rethinking of how they were both living. The life they had built was extraordinary, but extraordinary lives do not protect anyone from ordinary human vulnerability. The diagnosis made that undeniably clear, and everything that came after began reshaping itself around that truth. A cowboy's hardest decision. There is a particular kind of man who defines himself through his work. Ladd Drummond was that kind of man. He had grown up on that land. The ranch was not just his livelihood. It was his identity, his purpose, the clearest expression of who he was and what he valued. A cowboy who cannot work his land is not just a man without a job. He is a man without a story. That made what came next one of the hardest things Ladd Drummond had ever faced. The diagnosis forced a confrontation between two things he loved deeply: the legacy he had inherited and devoted his life to building, and the marriage and family that gave that legacy its meaning in the first place. He could not continue operating the ranch the way he always had, and also give his health and his relationship the attention they now required. Something had to change, something significant. For a man like Ladd, delegating is not simple. It is not just a management decision. It carries an emotional cost that people outside of that world rarely understand. Handing the cattle operations to his brothers meant admitting that he could no longer do everything alone. It meant stepping back from a role that had shaped him since childhood. It meant redefining what strength actually looked like in practice, but he made that decision anyway. Tim and Doug Drummond took on greater authority over the day-to-day ranch operations. Responsibilities that had always flowed through Ladd began flowing through others. He did not disappear from the land entirely. The ranch was still his and his presence was still felt, but the weight he had always carried alone was now being shared in a way it never had been before. What Ladd chose, quietly and without public announcement, was presence over tradition. He chose to be there, genuinely and fully, for Ree and for his children. Rather than maintaining an identity built on doing everything himself, he chose the marriage over the myth of the tireless cowboy who never slows down. That kind of transformation rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with a press release or a dramatic conversation. It happens in small daily choices, in mornings spent differently, and evenings that used to be filled with work, now filled with something quieter. Ladd Drummond did not stop being a rancher. He simply became something more important first. A husband choosing his partner over his pride, and a father choosing presence over legacy. That is not weakness. By any real measure, that is the hardest and most honest kind of strength. The empire slows down. The Pioneer Woman brand did not happen by accident. It was built over nearly 2 decades of relentless output, blog posts published with extraordinary consistency, cookbooks that climbed bestseller lists and stayed there, a Food Network show that ran season after season without losing its audience, a store in Pawhuska, Oklahoma that turned a tiny town into a genuine tourist destination. It became part of the furniture of American food culture. At its peak, the Pioneer Woman brand was valued at figures that made it one of the most successful personal brands in the country. Ree had built something that went far beyond cooking content. She had built a world that people genuinely wanted to live inside, even if only for the length of a television episode or a single recipe road on a Tuesday afternoon. Keeping something like that alive requires an enormous amount of energy. And in 2023 and 24, that energy was being redirected. Cookbook contracts were quietly renegotiated or restructured around a slower timeline. Filming schedules for the Food Network show were adjusted to allow more flexibility. Public appearances, the kind that required travel and preparation and sustained social performance, were reduced without formal explanation. Each change was small enough on its own to be dismissed as routine. Together they told a different story. The Pioneer Woman Mercantile in Pawhuska continued operating, but with adjustments. Ree's direct involvement in certain aspects of the business was scaled back. The team around her absorbed more responsibility. The machine kept running, but the person at the center of it was no longer running at the same speed. What was remarkable was that the quality of what she produced did not suffer. In many ways, it improved. Content that was made with more intention and less urgency felt more considered. Recipes were richer. The writing had more space in it. When Ree did show up, she showed up fully rather than exhaustedly. The lesson embedded in that shift is one that many people resist learning until something forces it on them. Doing less with genuine focus and care often produces something better than doing everything all the time out of obligation and momentum. The Pioneer Woman empire slowed down. It did not fall. It did not fracture. It simply found a pace that a real human being could actually sustain. And in doing so, it quietly became something more honest than it had ever been before. The children who stepped forward. There is a moment in every family when the roles quietly reverse. It does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, in small gestures and unspoken understandings. A child starts showing up differently. They ask fewer questions and offer more help. They stop waiting to be told what to do and start anticipating what is needed. And somewhere in that shift, the family finds a new shape that nobody planned, but everyone needed. That is what happened with the Drummond children. Alex, Paige, Bryce, and Todd had grown up inside the Pioneer Woman world. They had appeared on the blog and the television show. They had been photographed at holidays and ranch gatherings and ordinary Tuesday dinners. They were familiar faces to an audience that had watched them move from childhood into adulthood over the course of many years. What the audience saw publicly was only part of the story. Behind the scenes, each of the Drummond children began stepping into new roles that the family's changed circumstances required. Alex, the eldest, had already built her own life and marriage, but she moved closer in the ways that matter most, showing up with consistency and quiet reliability when her parents needed support without asking for it. Paige brought her own energy and capability to the spaces that were opening up. Whether in the business, on the ranch, or simply in the rhythm of daily family life, she was present in ways that went beyond what anyone expected of her age and stage of life. Bryce and Todd, the younger sons, stepped into ranch responsibilities with a seriousness that reflected both their upbringing and their genuine love for the land. The work that Ladd had always modeled for them, the early mornings and physical effort and quiet dedication, became something they now carried forward with their own hands. None of this was announced. No family statement was released. No social media post explained the shift in dynamics or celebrated the way the next generation was holding things together. It simply happened the way real loyalty always does, without performance and without applause. What the Drummond children demonstrated was something that cannot be taught directly. It can only be absorbed over years of watching parents show up for each other and for the land and for the work. When the moment came that required them to show up in return, they already knew how. Families reveal their true character not in the good times, but in the quiet, difficult ones. The Drummond children stepped forward when it mattered, and in doing so, they became the strongest part of the foundation their parents had spent a lifetime building. What goodbye really means. Some goodbyes are loud, They come with announcements and explanations and public moments of closure. Some goodbyes are so quiet that the person saying them barely recognizes the moment themselves. There is no ceremony, no final day, just a gradual loosening of something that used to feel permanent, until one morning you realize it no longer holds the same grip it once did. For Ree and Ladd Drummond, this chapter was full of the second kind. The first thing they said goodbye to was the work-first mentality that had driven everything for so long. Ree had built her brand on output. More posts, more recipes, more seasons, more books, more appearances. The momentum of constant creation had become so familiar that slowing down felt almost dangerous, like taking your foot off a pedal on a steep hill. But the circumstances of their lives made that choice unavoidable. And what they discovered on the other side of it was not disaster. It was relief. Ladd said goodbye to overextension in his own way. The ranch had always demanded everything from him, and he had always given it willingly. Saying goodbye to that version of himself, the man who measured his worth in hours worked and acres managed, required a kind of internal reckoning that does not happen quickly or easily. It required him to separate who he was from what he did, and to discover that the person underneath the work was still whole. There was also a quieter goodbye happening inside Ree's relationship with her own identity. She had spent years being the pioneer woman, not just as a brand name, but as a personal definition. It shaped how she thought about her days and her value and her place in the world. Letting go of the pressure to always be producing, always be visible, always be giving the audience something new meant releasing a version of herself she had inhabited for nearly 2 decades. What replaced all of it was not emptiness, it was space. Space for the marriage to breathe. Space for honest conversations that busy schedules had been crowding out. Space to accept help without feeling like accepting help meant failing. Saying goodbye to overextension and identity tied entirely to productivity is not a small thing. For people who have built their lives around doing and achieving, it can feel like losing something essential. But what the Drummonds found was that they were not losing themselves. They were finally making enough room to actually find each other again, learning to live differently. The new rhythm did not arrive fully formed. It was built slowly, one small decision at a time. Mornings on the Drummond Ranch had always been defined by urgency. There was always something that needed doing before the sun had fully risen. Always a reason to move fast and think about the day in terms of task completed and ground covered. That version of morning still existed in some form because ranches do not pause for personal reinvention. But inside that familiar structure, something softer had been allowed to grow. Shared mornings became a priority in a way they had never quite been before. Not elaborate or performative, just present. Coffee before the rush. A conversation that was not about logistics. Small moments of togetherness that used to get swallowed by the pace of everything, but were now being deliberately protected. Ladd's involvement in ranch operations continued, but at a pace that reflected his health requirements rather than the standard he had always held himself to. The shared leadership model that had emerged out of necessity was proving to be genuinely effective. His brothers had stepped into their expanded roles with capability and commitment. The ranch was not suffering under the new structure. In many ways, it was operating with greater stability, because responsibility was distributed rather than concentrated in a single person. Addie's creative work found a new relationship with time. She was no longer creating content on the schedule that external pressure and audience expectation had previously dictated. She was creating on her own timeline, finishing things when they were ready rather than when they were due. The result was work that felt more alive and more considered than content produced under constant deadline pressure. Travel for medical appointments and ongoing treatment had become a regular part of their calendar. Rather than treating these trips as interruptions to real life, the family began folding them into their rhythm as simply another part of how things worked now. Treatment was not separate from living. It was part of living, and approaching it that way removed some of the weight that medical necessity can carry when it is framed as an obstacle. The children remained close and involved. Family gatherings that might once have been squeezed between competing commitments were now given more room to breathe and last longer than they used to. None of this looked dramatic from the outside. It rarely does when real change happens inside a family, but the difference between the life they were living now and the one they had been living before was significant, quieter, and slower, and more intentional, built around what actually mattered rather than what simply kept the engine running. Not the end, the reinvention. Every crisis carries something hidden inside it. Not a silver lining in the easy, dismissive sense of that phrase. Something harder and more honest than that. A forced confrontation with what actually matters when everything optional has been stripped away. A clarity that comfortable times rarely produce because comfortable times never demand it. The Drummonds did not choose any of what happened to them. They did not choose the fire or the crash or the diagnosis or the long road of adjustment that followed, but they chose, repeatedly and deliberately, how to respond to all of it. And those choices accumulated into something that looks very different from the life they were living before, but is in many ways more real than anything that came before it. The Pioneer Woman brand still exists. The ranch still runs. The family is still intact and still working and still rooted in the Oklahoma land that has defined them for generations. But the people living inside that story have been changed by what they carried through. Ladd Drummond redefined what it means to be strong. Drummond redefined what it means to be open. Their children demonstrated what it looks like when values are genuinely passed down rather than simply talked about. And together, they built something that no cookbook contract or television deal could ever fully capture. Legacy is not always what you produce. Sometimes, it is how you hold together when production is no longer possible. Sometimes, it is the quieter choice, the slower mourning, the shared decision to put a person above a brand. The Drummonds did not reach the end of their story. They simply stopped pretending that the old version of it was the only one worth telling. That is not a conclusion. That is how reinvention actually begins.